Hello and welcome back to Web 110 HTML and CSS. So this is going to be another video that pairs with Chapter 12's content. In the previous videos, I covered how to work with your folder organization and then also how to work with FileZilla to upload your files to the student server space. In this video, I'm going to be actually talking about web publishing, so that way you have a little bit of background information on that. And I'm also going to introduce you to another activity and discussion that I would like for you to do once we've gone through this PowerPoint. So if you want to go back and look at this PowerPoint on your own in the future, I have a link under this web publishing section that has that PowerPoint. And then I also have a couple of links that is going to help you with your homework assignment. So in the homework assignment, you're going to be looking at different hosting. And so I've got some links that can help you with that. And then there's, of course, that FileZilla download and then the link there. So this is going to be the focus for that. I also have some links about accessibility, because when you are publishing your files, you want to check that your files are accessible. And so these are two links that will help you with doing that. And then under the homework section, you'll see this usability testing website. That's going to be the discussion that you're going to do for this week. All right, so this PowerPoint isn't going to actually take too long. You might notice it's 16 slides. And I like to make PowerPoints out of information that I feel like is going to be important enough that you might want to go back and look at it. And this way you don't have to worry about necessarily taking notes on every little piece of information. So the first part of this is going to be looking at some general tips when you are looking at getting a domain for your website. So some different tips. Domain names are the name of your website. So an example would be JCCC. That is our school's website address. Another example could be like my website is just WBandel. There's also like Google, Amazon. Those are all names of the website. So that's going to be the domain. So another example that's the name following at in an email address or after www in a web address. So you might have, like, for example, there's the Gmail where you have your username and then at gmail.com. So I've got some examples here. Google.com, Wikipedia.org, jccc.edu. And domain names usually cost approximately $30 a year. And that might sound pretty cheap, but the name is not the same thing as the hosting. The hosting is going to be like the student server space where you are actually putting your files in some sort of storage that someone else is providing for you. The domain is just going to be the name that you go to that is associated with that storage. So when you are paying for that storage, it's going to cost more than just $30. And you can actually buy them separately. And once you purchase a domain, you can renew it. So you could renew your domain every year. You could set it out that you want to have ownership of it for like 5 years, whatever you want to do, but you can own that domain. And then if you find that you want to host your website at a different location, you can move your files over to a different host and you can just transfer that domain over to that new hosted space. And that's something that I've done multiple times where I've tried out different host providers to see kind of what I liked or not. And like right now, currently, I had had a host and they sold my contract to another company, and I didn't really care for their support that they offered. I felt like the company that they had transferred it to, I felt like they were a bit green and they just didn't seem like they had as well fleshed out of a service. It seemed like they were kind of a little bit more of a new upcoming company, and I wanted better support if I was going to be paying the same amount of money. So I just decided to end that contract. And then right now I'm currently squatting at WordPress. And that's something that we use a lot when working with clients, because a lot of times people prefer to take over their website and be able to maintain it themselves. So that's something you can easily do. You can have your domain, purchase it through one service. You could purchase it through WordPress, and then you could buy your own hosting space, and then you could transfer that domain over back and forth. I've probably transferred mine maybe about 5 times or something. So it's something that's not really that difficult to do, though sometimes it does require having a good understanding of how to read the documentation for it. So anyways, domain name versus URL. A URL is a complete web address used to find a particular web page. While the domain is the name of the website, a URL will lead to any one of the pages that is within the website. Every URL contains a domain name, as well as other components needed to locate the specific page or piece of content. So some more examples. Again, that google.com, which is the landing homepage. And then an example for like Wikipedia would be a particular Wikipedia page on umami. And then here I've got the trending feed for YouTube. And those would all be different URLs that are part of that domain. So when you are trying to choose a name, you want to make sure that it makes sense for the content that you are creating. So for example, I chose WBandel because it ends up being my username for a lot of different accounts. And it's going to be something that I at least will be able to find easily by typing in my last name. I could technically write out my whole name, but I've found that it's often better, and that's the second point, is to keep it short if it makes sense too. You also want to avoid hyphens. You want to try to keep everything as short as possible. You can use more than just .com, so if it makes sense to have .net or .info or something else, you can do that. There are certain ones that you can't do. Like you would need to make sure that you are an actual organization if you wanted to use .org, or you would actually need to be part of the government to do .gov. And you want to avoid trademarked words. Like I wouldn't want to have my website say WhitneyBandelDisney.com or something, because Disney would be something that would be trademarked. So just be careful when you are picking your name that there's not some sort of copyright violation where that might be already trademarked by someone else. And then the last point is it's good to have an idea of what other people are using, whether that's to avoid trademark issues or just being familiar with the type of keywords that people are using and searching for, so that way your website's more likely to come up in search engine searches. So you can use any of these services, and these are ones that I have listed on Canvas that you could go and you could look to see if somebody already has purchased the domain that you are interested in. So for example, you might have a common name where if you were wanting to go and create a portfolio website for yourself, it might be kind of difficult to do. I've got a friend who, his name is Alan Moore, and it's the same name of a famous comic book creator. And unfortunately, they both are interested in art and they're both interested in illustration. And so when my friend wanted to make a website, he had to consider how could he try to differentiate himself from all the other Alan Moores, but in particular, how to differentiate himself between him and this famous comic artist, so that way he can make sure that he actually shows up in search results. So just something to consider, whether it's putting Alan Moore painting, Alan Moore art, whatever it might be. So this is just going into that idea of domains being separate from web hosting, like I was saying before, but some little tidbits of information. Purchasing a domain name is different than hosting your website, though usually you'll do both at the same time, at least when you're doing your first purchase. A web hosting service provider provides technologies and services needed for the website or web page to be viewed in the internet. So they're going to be storing your files. And sometimes, depending on what sort of contract you have, they might be providing support to you to help a little bit with that. And then websites are hosted or stored on special computers called servers. And you're already a little familiar with that with the student server space. And the domain name points to this storage when people type in the IP address. So when you are choosing a web host, you might be going to a website to do some research, kind of like this hostingreview.com website. Your homework assignment is going to be where I want you to do a little bit of research and kind of look at different hosting providers and get kind of familiar with what kind of information you can look up on that. So I would really suggest using this website, but you could also do searches on your own using other websites. And this search result comes from March 2014, and if you were to go to this website now, it would probably look quite different. I would say every semester that I've showed this to classes, the results in this top 10 list, they look quite different. So they're kind of always changing. And so you might want to look for a little bit of consistency too on ones that sort of show up as being good, reliable sources. And there's all sorts of different criteria to think about. You could be looking at the price, but you want to think about what is exactly in that price. How much storage are you guaranteed? And what is you might not necessarily be told the server location, but where is the server? Are you going to have a problem with loading time and people trying to contact, or when people trying to look at your files? Is there going to be a significant amount of downtime where there's going to be server maintenance and your website might not be accessible? What sort of support might they be willing to give you? How are they going to handle the accounts? If you are working on a website with other individuals, you might need to be able to have a separation between the account where somebody can access the billing versus the account where someone's actually uploading the files. So that way, if you have a client who they want to have their personal information on there, you could still upload and maintain the files without that crossing over at all. So there's just a lot of things that you need to consider. So the next thing that I'm going to cover is going to be thinking about how to make sure that your files, when they are on the internet, how they can actually perform better in search engine searches and how to optimize that. And there's a whole class that is designated just to looking at search engine optimization. I'd really recommend that in the future. There's a 1 credit class. It goes on for 5 weeks and it goes into this in more detail. So a couple of things to think about would be use keywords that people might search for, because when you have a website and it is on the internet and people are interacting with it, it's going to start coming up in searches. And if you have keywords on your website will get indexed, where when people look at those keywords, your website will get some sort of ranking on how well it fits that criteria and how often it will come up on the search. You want to use descriptive page titles. So if you are looking at the title tag in the head section, that's going to be the part that is going to go on the window tab. That's what that would be referring to. And then you want to use semantic HTML, which means that you are using proper HTML that validates, that's using all the HTML5 tags that we looked at in previous chapters. Now this is going into some information that's a little bit beyond our class, but the biggest idea is looking at this meta tag. Now we've already looked at the meta tag for the character set information. When you are working on optimizing search engine results, you can use the meta tag and the name to pick things like description and keywords, and then you set the content attribute to the information that would go there. So here we have description, and then we have The content is Web 110, HTML, and CSS. So that would be the description that would show up when you would look at this website and preview it in the search engine results. And then same thing if you had keyword and then content, you could list out a bunch of different keywords that are relevant to your page. Something else, to keep search engines from indexing a website, you can choose and set the name to robots, and then you can say that you want to not index it or follow the information on there, and you can even disallow it. So if you've got a website that's under construction and you don't want the pages that you're working on to be part of your search results information, you could go and do that. All right, so I'm at Google and I'm going to type in HTML and CSS. So what we're seeing here is all of the websites that have been associated with these terms, HTML and CSS, and you'll notice that some of them have this text description, and then they also have some information here, like I've got links, try it yourself, start the exercise. And then if you continue to scroll, you can see the same thing. We've got here a description, we've got tutorials and courses, cascading style sheets, JavaScript, web APIs. So this is what it means to have descriptions and keywords where you are helping to share information in the meta tag that is going to be relevant, so that way people can get kind of a general idea of your content before they even go and click on your page. So some things that you can do to make your website more SEO friendly: you can verify that all your hyperlinks work. You want to be careful also which links you use to link to other websites. You don't want to bring down the reputation of your website by linking to just anything. You want to use meaningful alternative text descriptions on your images, and that can actually help with looking at image search engine results. That can be one way that you can drive traffic to your website. You want to make sure that you validate your code. Make sure that your content is just good quality content, and then you want to include keywords in your titles, headers, the first paragraph of your content. So if you've got multiple sections, you want to make sure every first paragraph in each section has something relevant, and then your hyperlinks as well. So when you are naming your files, so a little bit different than your domain, your actual individual files. Like think about that cat image that I had in the previous video. So you want to use lowercase. You want to use hyphens instead of spaces. You want to make sure there's no white space at all when you are linking to a file, whether it's an HTML, an image, whatever it is. You want to make sure there's no white space. So if you need to name something to make it more clear, use a hyphen. Avoid special characters. You want it to be short and brief. And you want to use a name that reflects the file, that's going to make sense. And then you want to be careful with version names. So there's kind of two different mindsets to how you might name your files and organize them. When you are working with your files for the actual website, you want to do this as much as possible. Now, copies of your files, you might have more information to help you keep track of those files. And, if there's a 2022 version of your portfolio picture, then you might say 2022 portfolio.jpg. And then you might have those other versions so you can more quickly browse through and keep track of those files. But when you are replacing those files on your actual website page, you want to keep a really simple name, so that way you're not having to go through and change every single link that is referencing that file name. Because let's say that you update that and you've got several references to it in different areas, you would have to go and update it so it says 2022 instead of 2020, for example. So that could be really annoying and difficult to have to do, especially if you have a very large website. So try to keep your name simple for your actual website that's going to be published. And then you can have a copy of those files and organize them in a way that's more meaningful with version numbers and dates and everything in the rest of your files stored locally. So some different concepts, and we've already talked about some of this before with FileZilla. I didn't really talk about the actual idea of FTP though. So FTP, that's File Transfer Protocol, is used for transferring files from your computer and to the server space. So it's between a client and a server. Your web host might have their own service for transferring files. Otherwise, you can use an FTP software like FileZilla. So that's what I showed you in the last video, is using something like FileZilla. Some of the hosting providers you might look at, they might have a cPanel area that might be really user-friendly, where it's very much click and drag. But as you saw with FileZilla, even though there's not much to look at graphically, FileZilla is also very much click and drag. It's just more of a matter of needing to set up the server information in the site manager, but even that isn't really that difficult. So that's sort of what to expect with that file transfer protocol though. So with file validation, you want to make sure that you validate your files before you upload them and publish them, but then you also want to double check again afterwards. And you want to make sure that you validate both the HTML and the CSS. So I've got links here for both the HTML validator and the CSS validator. Once you have published your files, you also want to test in different browsers. These are kind of the most common ones: Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. It's really a good idea to test in all of these because certain things are going to look different in different browsers. And as I introduce HTML and CSS to you, I'm going to try to show you examples of different things that I've noticed as really standing out as being different. In particular, there are certain form elements that have a tendency to look a little bit different if you're on a Mac, for example. But you also want to check on different devices too. You want to check to see, what does a website look like on a laptop screen? What does it look like on a monitor? What does it look like on a tablet, on a mobile device? And one of the things I think I encountered the most with student final projects is students might design for a laptop, and because they don't have access to a monitor that has a larger resolution size than a laptop, your website for the final and what I might end up seeing could end up looking different than what you intended, because you might have designed it specifically for that smaller size, not knowing and not being able to resize your window to be able to preview it for those other sizes. So it's good to just give yourself a variety of different devices if possible. And if you don't have a larger monitor to preview your work and you're really curious about how it might look, you could go onto campus and use one of the computers there to be able to preview your work. The computer lab does have some Windows computer and Mac computers, so if you wanted to be able to see what it looks like on a couple of different ones or a couple of different browsers, you could do that. And I'm not saying you have to do that for every project, but it might be something that might be interesting for you to do, at least for the final. All right, so then when you are launching your website and publishing it, you also want to do accessibility testing to see how your website is functioning. And I've got a couple of links here. It looks like this Achecker website, they might have changed the address to it. I'm going to have to see if I can find a replacement, but this other one is going to work well enough. This is wave.webaim.org, and you can type in an address. I like to pick on our school website. And out of the two, I actually prefer this one better because it's more visual anyways. The other one is kind of like the validation website where it gives you a lot of text information to look at and it can be a little overwhelming. But this is kind of nice. So we can look at this and it'll give us a summary. And as the web developer, it is up to you to read this feedback and to determine what is going to be a deal breaker and what is something that you think is acceptable. So an example that I think is going to be easiest for us to look at is going to be the contrast errors. So we can view the details and we can click on these, but we can also just kind of scroll through and we'll be able to see what sort of information it's giving us. So you'll see that with these contrast sections, it's basically giving us an error, and it's saying that because there's this transparent layer that's over top of this image, the way that it is analyzing it, it thinks that there's not enough contrast there. There's a little bit more to these layers though, because of how it has that blue also behind it, and then there's the text which is white. So this would be a good point, I think, for doing user testing, because then you can do a survey, you could do a focus group, and you could ask a bunch of people, do you have a hard time reading this? Or you could try to determine for yourself, do you think this is an acceptable amount of contrast? I think it is, I would call this an acceptable amount of contrast. I do think it's not necessarily the contrast that's the issue though. I do think there's a lot of texture that's behind the text, and I personally think that that makes it a little hard to read. Also, the amount of space between the characters and the fact that it has this underline, I actually think that more than anything makes it a little hard to read. So I would probably just tweak this text a little bit, maybe make it a little bit larger like the text is over here, or add a little bit of space between the characters since it's all uppercase. But I don't think that the contrast necessarily makes it hard to read. So that's kind of an example. Or like here, this is saying this is hard to read. I don't think the text color is the problem. I do again think that this image might be a little hard to read this text over just because there's a lot of color variation. But I don't think it's that bad because they've put that color over top of the image to help it stand out a little bit. So that's going to be one example. You can kind of run other websites through this if you wanted to check different websites out. All right, and then the last thing that I have for you is I have an activity that I want for you to do, and I think I've got a typo in this PowerPoint. But I want you to evaluate the website. I'm going to give you a website. I want you to evaluate a website based off of the following things, and I'm going to have you respond to that in the discussion. So I want you to look at how intuitive of a design the website is. So how easy is it for a new user to understand the organization of the site? And then ease of learning. How do experienced users perceive the website? I think what's going on here is I think ease of learning, this should be how do inexperienced users perceive the website. So if you haven't been to it before. And then this one should be efficiency of use. How do experienced users perceive the website? So inexperienced versus experienced. And that's going to have to be your own best guess, because some of you might have been to the website before and you might have a preconceived notion. Some of you probably haven't been to the website before, so you're just going to be guessing. There's not going to be a right or wrong answer. And then memorability. When a visitor returns to a website, do they remember enough to use it productively? That's going to just be your best guess. You know, do you think that given some time, someone would be able to figure things out pretty well? Error frequency and severity. Do visitors make errors? How easy is it to recover from the error? That's going to depend a lot on what you interact with. I do want you to spend quite a bit of time. Usually when I do this face-to-face, I give people maybe about 10, 15 minutes. Usually I put people in groups so you can kind of brainstorm with someone else to see if you can kind of come up with a list of errors. So it'll probably be a little quicker for you to go through it on your own. But I do want you to give yourself about 10 minutes or so you can go through a significant amount of the website to get a feel for it. So you might encounter errors. You might not though. So it's going to change a little bit. And then subject satisfaction. Do users like using the website? And I know that's going to vary a lot. So you're going to have all this criteria, and that's the end of that PowerPoint. So I'm going to go back to Canvas. So under week 2, there's going to be the second discussion. So you should have already looked at this poor website design examples one. You're going to go to this usability testing, and the website. I picked the Johnson County government website because the college is in Johnson County. So I figured that people may or may not be familiar with it, or if not, you're probably somewhat familiar with the area, even if you don't live in Johnson County. So I've got a link to the website, and then I've got a list here. And again, I've got that typo. It should be, let me edit this real quick. All right. So, intuitive, how easy is it for a new user to understand? And some of these might sound pretty similar. It's okay. You're going to just kind of put your best approximation. And then I want you to give a sentence summary for each category explaining your ranking. You do not need to reply to anyone else's post. I'm just kind of looking for a general feel. I'm very curious to kind of see how people have a tendency to rank things. If you want to look at other people's rankings too, you can, just out of curiosity. And I want you to rank them all individually, and then I want you to give it an overall ranking. And I've had people ask before, like, what sort of scale should this be ranked on? It's okay if you use your own scale. What I've done in the past is I've had people do like on a scale of kind of like 0 to 10. Like if you think of it a little bit like a letter grade too, like you could do, I'm giving an A to this, a B to this, or you could think of it kind of like if you got a 9 out of 10 on an assignment, that would be a 90%. So you could kind of grade things that way. And then for the overall grade, I've had some people where they count everything up and they average it. And then I've also had people just do kind of like a gut feeling. So let's say that you have like one section where it's a 6 and one where it's a 10. You wouldn't have to go right in between. You could determine like, this, even though I ranked all these individual things, I still think it's maybe like a 9, for example. All right, so you're going to hit reply, and you're going to do that before or when everything is due. All right, so the actual website. Now, this website actually recently got kind of an overhaul. So it actually looks quite different since I first started doing this assignment. In the past, I felt like it had a lot of issues with I don't want to bias you too much, but in the past, I felt like it had quite a bit of issues with the navigation. And as you can imagine, government websites, they just have a lot of information. They have a lot of people who are looking at it. They just have a lot of things that people might need to find, and they need to just provide a whole lot. And they're working with a lot of different branches, and it could be that some things are on their website, some things will take you off to other departments that aren't necessarily part of this website. So that's why I want you to look around for quite a while just to familiarize yourself with the website, because your initial impression on just the homepage could be quite different than if you continue to go through the website quite a bit. And I would recommend that you look at it on desktop and mobile if you can, even if it's just resizing the website to kind of see what the preview of it. So take a look at it, kind of get a feel. If there's anything interesting that you found that you want to share as well that doesn't fit into the criteria, feel free to add any kind of other comments that you might have too. I'd be really curious though to see everyone's impressions. I feel like since the overhaul, I guess this is a bit of spoilers, but I feel like the ratings that students gave were more positive than they have been in the past. I'm not going to say like what the general average is, but I think that's really good to hear, is that, websites are slowly improving rather than getting worse, which is what that's what we expect, is for things to get better. All right, so there's going to be just one last video that I'm going to introduce for this week. It's a little early, but I'm going to have you watch a video about the midterm so you can start thinking about it. You're going to have plenty of time. Well, you're going to have a little bit of time to work on it over the next couple of weeks, but I just wanted you to be able to watch that, especially since this class is over the summer and you're basically, you have half the time that you normally would have to really work on the midterm. So I'm introducing it a little earlier than I normally would in the fall or spring semesters. So that video isn't going to pertain to one of the chapters, but it will be something that I think will be beneficial for you to go ahead and watch as soon as possible. All right, so as always, if you have any questions, send me an email or you can comment on the discussion board.